Hello, and welcome to The Aesthetic Philosophy. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at Americanism, which is a set of United States patriotic values aimed at creating a collective American identity. And the reason I'm going to be looking at this is because I think that the political divide in the United States right now is bigger than it has been since the Revolution. The political left and the political right are at complete polar opposites, it seems, and that political window of centrism is drastically minimizing itself. With the idea of Americanism as being a collective identity, I think it got lost. So I'm going to try to dissect where it got lost, if that was a good thing or a bad thing, and what that means for the future of America. Let's begin by coming up with a more airtight definition as to what Americanism is. It can be defined as an articulation of the nation's rightful place in the world, a set of traditions, a political language, and a cultural symbol imbued within political meaning. According to the American Legion, a U.S. veterans organization, Americanism is an ideology or belief in devotion, loyalty, or allegiance to the United States of America, or to its flag, traditions, customs, culture, symbols, institutions, or form of government. In the words of Theodore Roosevelt, Americanism is a question of spirit, conviction, and purpose, not of creed or birthplace. So that tells us that Americanism is something that anyone can really have, whether a citizen or just a resident. It's all about the allegiance, it's about loyalty. But some argue that Americanism has two different meanings. It can refer to the defining characteristics of the United States, but can also signify loyalty to the United States and a defense of American political ideals. These ideals include, but are not limited to, the government itself, equal standing in court, freedom of speech, and a belief in progress. This collection of ideals that forms the modern ideology of Americanism holds an enduring appeal to the people from lands throughout the globe. Having formed a more solid definition of Americanism, I think we can begin to look at its history. In an essay devoted to Americanism, Agnes Replier emphasizes that, of all the countries in the world, we, and only we, have only need to create artificially the patriotism which is in the birthland of other nations. Since the radical and ethnic demographic alterations of the American population caused by the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, Americanism has been rooted less in shared cultural experiences and more in shared political ideals. The concept of Americanism has been around since the first European settlers moved to North America, inspired by a vision of a shining city on a hill. John Adams wrote that the new settlement in America was the opening of a grand scene and design in providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of all mankind all over the earth. Such undertaking of Americanism was commonly thinking throughout the New World after the American Revolutionary War, with the exceptions that the newly independent nation would become more than what Thomas Paine called for as an asylum for mankind. During the antebellum period, throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, Americanism acquired a restrictive political meaning due to more naivist moral panics after increased Irish and German immigration led to the growth of American Catholicism. The years from the end of the Civil War to the end of World War II brought new meaning to the term Americanism to millions of immigrants coming from Europe and Asia. Those times were times of great economic growth and industrialization, and thus brought forth the American scene consisting of industrial democracy and the thinking that then people are the government in America. Since then, the success of the American nation has brought tremendous power to the notion of Americanism. According to Wendy L. Wall in The Inventing of the American Way, Americanism was presented by a national propaganda campaign to contrast with communism and fascism during the Cold War. The benefits of Americanism were promoted through the ideals of freedom and democracy. Some organizations have embraced Americanism but taken its ideals further. For example, the Ku Klux Klan believes that Americanism includes aspects of race, purity of the white American, and of American Protestantism. Professor of Political Science at Claremont University, C. Bradley Thompson, stated that the meaning of Americanism today, however, is very different. To the extent that the term is even still used, its meaning has been hijacked by both the left and the right. The left most often identifies Americanism with multiculturalism, relativism, environmentalism, regulation, and welfarism. In other words, with progressivism. The right typically identifies Americanism with Christianity, school prayer, tradition, family values, and community standards. In other words, with social conservatism. None of these values are, however, uniquely American. In fact, in one form or another, they all have distinctly European provenance that is set in direct proportion or opposition to the native meaning of Americanism. With a tighter definition of what Americanism is, I think we can now begin to look at the political divisions of the United States. Political divisions of the United States are the various recognized governing entities that form together the United States, the District of Columbia, territories, and Indian reservations. The primary first-level political division of the United States is the state. There are 50 states which are bound together in a union. Each state holds governmental jurisdiction over a defined geographic territory and shares its sovereignty with the United States federal government. According to numerous decisions from the United States Supreme Court, the 50 individual states and the United States as a whole are each sovereign jurisdictions. The states are not administrative divisions of the country, in that their powers and responsibilities are in no way assigned to them from above by federal legislation or the Constitution, but rather they exercise all powers of government not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. All state governments are modeled after the federal government and consist of 3 branches, although the 3-branch structure is not constitutionally required. These are executive, legislative, and judicial. They retain plenary power to make laws covering anything not preempted by the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes, or treaties ratified by the U.S. Senate, and are organized as presidential stems where the governor is both head of government and head of state, even though this too is not required. The various states are then typically subdivided into counties. Louisiana uses the term parish, and Alaska uses the term borough for what the U.S. Census Bureau terms county equivalent in those states. Counties and county equivalents may be further subdivided into townships. Towns in New York, Wisconsin, and New England are treated as equivalents to the townships by the Census Bureau. Townships or towns are used as subdivisions of a country in 20 states, most importantly in the Northeast and Midwest. Population centers may be organized into incorporated cities, towns, villages, and other types of municipalities. Municipalities typically subordinate to a county government, with some exceptions. Certain cities, for example, have consolidated with their county government as consolidated city counties. In Virginia, cities are completely independent from the county in which they would otherwise be a part. In some states, particularly in New England, towns form the primary unit of local government below the state level, and in some cases eliminate the need for county government entirely. Other subnational divisions include the District of Columbia and several minor outlying islands and Indian reservations, all of which are administered by the federal government. With a more well-rounded understanding of the geographical divides in America, now we can combine the 2 topics that we've looked at, so Americanism and the political divide, and begin to look at America's political divide. The animation that I am showing on the screen now shows the political divide from 1994 to 2017, and I got it off of the visualcapitalist.com. This website goes into depth and it explains it as: the animation above demonstrates how the political divide by party has grown significantly and consistently over 23 years. In 1994, the general public was more mixed in their alliances, but a significant divergence started to occur from 2011 onwards. By 2017, the divide has significantly shifted towards the two extremes of the consistently liberal/conservative scale. Median Democrat and Republican sentiment has also moved further apart, especially for politically engaged Americans. What the study on this website also does is it breaks down different political aspects to show the true divide between the American political systems. So let's begin by looking at Americans on the economy. Several survey questions were designed to assess Americans' perceptions of the economy. Surprisingly, between 60 to 7% of Democrats and Republicans agree that U.S. involvement in the global economy is positive because it provides the country with access to new markets. However, they diverge when asked about the fairness of the economic system itself. 50% of Republicans think that it is fair to most Americans, but 82% of Democrats think it unfavorably favors powerful interests. Finally, 73% of Democrats think corporations make too much profit, while only 43% of Republicans think so. Since 1994, Democrats have become more convinced of this point, gaining 10 percentage points, while Republican impressions have fluctuated only marginally. Americans on the environment. When it comes to climate change, both Democrats and Republicans see that there is growing evidence for global warming, but they are not sold on the reasons why. 78% of Democrats see human activity as the cause, while only 24% of Republicans agree. Americans also disagree on whether stricter sustainability laws are worth the cost. 77% of Democrats think so, but only 36% of Republicans are on the same page. The position of Democrats on this issue has increased by 11 percentage points since 1994, but dropped by double 22 percentage points for Republicans during this time. Americans on the government. Americans are highly concerned about the U.S. presence of the global stage. Over half, 56% of Democrats, think that the U.S. should be active in world affairs, while 54% of Republicans think that such attention should be focused inward instead of overseas. This filters into what they consider the best strategy for peace, with 83% of Democrats believing in democracy to achieve this, whilst only 33% of Republicans agree, preferring military strength instead. Democrats have cemented their position on diplomacy by 17 percentage points since 1994, growing the political divide. Americans on their society. On several social issues, both parties have become more liberal in their opinions over the decades, especially on immigration and homosexuality. Democrats have seen the biggest advancement of their views on immigration, from 32% in favor in 1994 to 84% in 2017. However, there is still a wide partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans on their ideas of government aid and racial inequality, immigration, and homosexuality, with the gaps ever increasing. Americans on each other. It is evident that not only does the American public hold less of a mix of liberal and conservative values, but the center of this political divide has also moved dramatically on both ends of the spectrum. In simple terms, it means that Americans are less willing to consider the other side of debates, preferring to stay entrenched in the group they think of their political affiliation. Not only this, but partisan animosity is on the rise. 81% of Republicans and Democrats find those belonging to the other party equally unfavorable. In fact, both parties have seen a 28 percentage point increase in very unfavorable views of other people on the other party compared to 1994. So, can the rift be repaired? While the above data on group popularization ends in 2017, it's clear that the repercussions continue to have rippled effects into today and the future. These differences mean there is no consensus on the nation's key priorities. In 2019, Republicans believe that terrorism, the economy, social security, immigration, and the military should be on top of the mind, whilst Democrats refer to healthcare, education, environment, Medicare, and the poor and needy as their leads. With Trump's presidential term up for contest back in 2020, the lack of common ground on pressing issues will only continue to cause a stir among both Democratic and Republican bases. So, having established the definition of Americanism, looked at the political divides and where they lie, and assessed the political divides in depth, we can begin to look at the question of Americanism, the myth of America and Americanism. Is it dead, and was it ever real? The ultimate journal of America, The Atlantic, turned 160 years old 3 years ago, and in their November issue, they pondered this question. Both the left and the right have different ideals of what America stands for, and without a genuine national purpose or ties that unite, America can be considered to be dying. Political polarization is greater in the Trump era than at any other time in U.S. history since perhaps the Civil War, and Reconstruction eras has forced this question of what unites self-proclaimed America into full view. Here's a passage from the Atlantic piece. All of this has left many Americans feeling disoriented, their faith that their nation has something distinctive to offer the world shaken. On the left, many have gravitated towards a strange sort of universalism, forcing on America's flaws while admiring other nations' virtues. They decree nationalism and covet open borders, imagining a world in which ideas can prevail without nations to champion them. Even as the left is made queasy by the notion that the idea can be both good and distinctly American, many on the right now doubt that America is a land defined by a distinctive idea at all. President Donald Trump's rhetoric is curiously devoid of references to common civic creed. He promotes instead a more generic nationalism, one defined, like any nation's, by culture, borders, and narrow interests and enemies. This entire discussion is so long overdue, I think at least. Some of my brethren on the left look at the democracies of Western Europe for inspiration, even though in many cases they are more classist and race-conscious societies than the United States has been in generations. Nations that enslaved whole races of people, like France, are seen as enlightened by some on the left when compared or contrasted with the United States. They often overstate the virtues of any non-American people, including those who don't share liberal values at all and are guided by religion, albeit religious other than Christianity. On the right, for many, Americanism is far more a statement of culture and thought, reflecting a knee-jerk nationalism and white identity more than anything truly ethnic or geographic. Various journals, books, and articles have been written by conservative thinkers to create an American identity and myth which is almost wholly manufactured or theoretical. From my position, I think that it is either time to stress what unites the American people or simply retire the term Americanism, because it really isn't a subnative one or a meaningful one. It's a term that has just been used to identify patriotism as a sort of corruption. The reality is that Americans are more invented by people, by and large. Outside of that, perhaps Native Americans or American Indians, in reality there is no such thing as an American. No American ethnicity exists, as the United States of America is a nation-state that was drawn on political lines. The failure of Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery's 1775 Quebec expedition, as well as the 1812 invasion of Canada, meant that the U.S. didn't even unite English-speaking white people largely living in North America, who could trace their lineage to the British Isles within its national boundaries. Short of some future annexation of Canada, The United States will never be a complete nation-state of white people in the North America from the British Isles or Northern Europe, and that's perfectly acceptable. The American Revolution also had some possible anti-Catholic undertones, which perhaps weren't played predominantly, but probably served as a reason Quebec and Florida chose at the time to stick with the British rule. The concept of an American or Americans as a distinct race of people came from the prose of Thomas Jefferson, a noted Francophile, in the Declaration of Independence. Defining Americans as a separate people from Britain served to try and transform what was in all facets a civil war contested by British brothers into a conflict between different peoples. The myth somehow that arbitrary boundaries between the 13th colonies and the other British colonies in North America constituted a separate people was done expressively for political reasons. The settlers and those in power of these colonies were British in all but name, and they remained for some time even after independence. Being an American is more of a state of mind than anything, or a statement of personal identity than anything else. I think few listening, unless you are a Native American, can claim to be a real American, in the Americanist sense of the word, through the spirit of Americanism is something that has been very real as a myth making and the concepts around being an American. In conclusion, I believe that the myth of American exceptionalism has been created to keep the fiction going on about unique people with a special place in global society. But the reality is that America is an idea, a myth, a thought, nothing real or tangible. It is a political entity which has a melting pot of different peoples whose ideas and innovations have transformed human society for the better. It is a nation whose own history is lamentable and tragic, but for a few short years after the 1940s saved the human race from likely destruction. From World War II, whatever comes out of identity of the American people, and the greatest generation passes from this earth, the nation has no meaning, no sense of joint purpose. Americanism is a rough thought. It is an idea more than anything distinct or tangible, as I have previously said. The nation-state that occupies a large swath of land on the North American continent has been an indisputable moving force in human progress and making an impact both positively and negatively on global history. But does being an American mean nothing beyond residing on the portion of North American continent? Given the current state of political and ethnic polarization within the United States, it's hard to make a case for the unity in purpose, spirit, or thought. I believe that a large reason for American success over the years has been its ability to compromise, and as the political divide increases, this ability it's becoming clear that it's an ability that's being lost. Overall, then, I think we conclude that Americanism is the idea or myth of unity between the American peoples. However, it was one propagated by political ideologies, and one that can easily be taken down. It's an ideology and nothing more. I also think that the political divide is only going to increase as the tensions in the American political system increase too, and more radical divisions just keep growing and growing, and I think it's just a vicious cycle. And the fact that America is losing its inherent trait that used to be compromise, I think it's inevitable that the polarization in terms of the political spectrum is only growing bigger. So if one were to argue that Americanism did exist, I think it no longer does. And for those who believe it never even existed in the first place and was in fact a myth, well then it certainly doesn't exist now. But these are just my opinions, and I'd love to know what you have to think. Please be sure to leave your opinions in the comments if you agree or disagree. I'm really interested with what people think about this. Also, please give this video a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. And subscribe. That would be really, really helpful. I post once a week every Wednesday. Well, it's been every Wednesday so far on my channel, and I try to do it on Wednesday, but at least I post at least once a week every week. Probably Wednesday. We don't know. And most of my videos are in a similar vein to this one, just like commentary, analysis on different topics that interest me, mostly political topics, but you know, it can vary. And I also have a literary series running on my channel, which I will link the previous two kind of episodes of that series down below. So I've looked at The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky and Animal Farm by George Orwell. So if either of these novels excite you or interest you, then please check out those videos. And yeah, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will hopefully see you next week. Have a nice day.